Imagine a night where stars hang low, a silent valley wrapped in stillness, and a gentle master holding a small wooden puppet, asking a question that will change everything. What does it mean to truly be free? Join Jesus and his disciples in a story of love, choice, and faith that cuts deeper than any command, setting hearts on a journey that challenges each one to let go of the strings and discover the courage to live freely. By the end, you'll find yourself asking, are you bound, or are you free? The night wrapped the valley in a deep, solemn quiet, as if nature itself held its breath in reverence. The fire, a small yet steady beacon in the darkness, crackled and popped, sending small embers dancing up into the air like fragile stars of their own. Each disciple was seated around the fire, absorbed in his own thoughts, the silence between them as thick as the chill that hung in the air. Peter, leaning slightly forward, gazed into the flames, feeling the warmth on his face but sensing a strange, introspective chill within. Images of his past, his impulsive words and actions floated through his mind. The memories weighed heavy, making him wonder about the path he'd chosen and the man he was becoming. John, seated to his left, had his hands clasped tightly in his lap, head slightly bowed as though he were in prayer. John's thoughts were of loyalty and devotion, of what it truly meant to follow Jesus, not just in body but in spirit. He wondered if he could be the rock, the unbreakable foundation of faith, that Jesus believed him to be. Around the fire, others sat in similar reflection, lost in the flickering shadows of the flames, yet bonded by the silent question that seemed to hover in the air, a question they were all pondering but could not quite articulate. Jesus, seated at the heart of the circle, sensed their restlessness. His gaze was gentle, wise, as he looked upon each of them in turn. He could feel the tension, the silent longing for answers, guidance, perhaps even reassurance. And with a soft smile, he invited them closer. "Come," he said, his voice carrying warmth and tenderness. "Tonight I have a story to share with you." His words were simple, yet they held a depth that made the disciples sit up, drawn into his presence as though by an invisible thread. Slowly, one by one, they moved closer, settling around him in a circle, their faces lit by the glow of the fire. The valley was shrouded in a sacred stillness, as if it too were leaning in, eager to listen to the words of the Master. Each disciple felt something stir within, a sense of anticipation, as if they knew that whatever was to come would carry meaning beyond what they could see or touch. As the disciples waited, Jesus reached into the folds of his cloak and carefully drew out a small wooden puppet. Its limbs hung limply, bound together by delicate strings that crisscrossed between its arms and legs, holding it in place yet leaving it entirely lifeless. The disciples' curiosity was piqued as they leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the peculiar figure resting in Jesus' hands. Some of them exchanged curious glances, wondering what wisdom could possibly be drawn from such a simple, even childish object. Jesus held the puppet up for them to see, his eyes soft yet focused. "This puppet," he began, holding it between his fingers, "can only move when controlled by another." With gentle, practiced fingers, Jesus began to manipulate the strings, making the puppet's wooden limbs move with a clumsy grace. It raised one arm in a stiff salute, then dipped its head in an awkward bow, all movements that came not from the puppet itself but from the unseen hand guiding it. The disciples chuckled quietly, amused by the little show. It was endearing, the way the puppet seemed to mimic human actions, though clearly lifeless at its core. But as Jesus continued, his tone shifted, and so did the mood among the disciples. "Though it dances," he said softly, "it has no will of its own. Every gesture, every step, is dictated by the one who holds the strings. Without guidance, it falls, lifeless, unable to choose its own path." His fingers released the strings, letting the puppet hang still in his hand, its limbs dangling helplessly. The laughter faded from the disciples, replaced by a contemplative quiet. There was a weight in Jesus' words, a truth that seemed to settle upon them like a heavy cloak. Each disciple looked at the puppet differently now, as though it had transformed before their eyes, carrying a message they could sense but not yet fully grasp. Some saw a reflection of their own lives before meeting Jesus. A life dictated by routines, by the expectations of family, society, or the relentless push of their own desires. Others, like Thomas, who had always struggled to reconcile faith and doubt, looked upon the puppet with a mixture of curiosity and unease, wondering if there was something more to this simple object, something that touched upon the very essence of who they were. As the puppet hung in Jesus' hand, its strings limp and lifeless, Thomas could no longer hold back his curiosity. Always one to question, to seek reason behind every mystery, he leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Master," he began, his voice thoughtful, "what is wrong with the puppet following its master's will? Isn't it better to be guided than to stumble in the dark?" His question lingered in the cool night air, causing some of the other disciples to nod in agreement, feeling that Thomas had voiced a concern they hadn't dared to voice themselves. They were accustomed to following Jesus, to accepting his guidance as absolute, yet they couldn't deny the quiet fear that often crept into their hearts, the fear of being left without direction, of having to walk alone. Jesus turned to Thomas, his gaze filled with a mixture of compassion and understanding. His eyes held the depth of someone who had seen beyond human understanding, someone who knew not only the world's ways but also the fears, doubts, and longings that lay in every human heart. "A good question, Thomas," Jesus said gently. "But tell me, do you wish to live without choice? Do you want your life to be controlled, your path decided without your say?" Thomas hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. His mind raced, searching for an answer that would reconcile his desire for certainty with his yearning for freedom. "I'm not sure," he finally admitted, a note of vulnerability in his voice. He had always been torn between faith and skepticism, between following blindly and questioning every step. In a way, he was like the puppet, swayed back and forth by forces he couldn't fully understand. Jesus reached out and placed a comforting hand on Thomas's shoulder, his touch filled with warmth and reassurance. "It is not wrong to seek guidance, Thomas. But true love, true compassion cannot be commanded. They must be chosen freely and willingly. Only then can they be real." His words resonated deeply, stirring something within each disciple's heart, a truth that they could feel but couldn't yet fully grasp. They understood, in that moment, that the freedom Jesus spoke of was not about rebellion or aimlessness. It was a freedom born of love, a love that trusted them to find their own way, to choose their own path. Jesus laid the puppet gently aside, allowing the disciples a moment to absorb his words. The silence grew thick with contemplation, each man reflecting on his own past, the things that had bound him, controlled him, perhaps even broken him. It was Peter who broke the silence, his voice soft yet clear, as if he were speaking not only to Jesus but also to himself. "I remember," he began, "when I was a fisherman, every day felt like a cycle. Cast the net, haul the fish, count the catch. Day after day it was the same thing and I thought I was free. But now I see I was bound not by chains, but by my own ignorance, my own inability to see beyond the life I knew." His words struck a chord with the others, who nodded in quiet agreement. Many of them had felt similar bonds, chains they hadn't even recognized until they met Jesus. They realized that they had been living like the puppet, going through motions, fulfilling duties, bound by routines, yet never truly free. Jesus listened to Peter's story with a gentle smile, nodding in understanding. Sometimes we are bound not by others but by our own minds, our own fears and doubts. True freedom is not found in breaking every rule, but in knowing you have the choice. The disciples felt the weight of his words settle in their hearts. It was a revelation that struck deeply, stirring memories of past struggles, moments when they had felt trapped, unable to see beyond their own limitations. They realized that freedom was not about escaping from their lives, but about understanding that they had the power to shape their path, to choose their steps. The silence that followed Peter's story was thick with contemplation. Each disciple sat immersed in his own thoughts, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Jesus reached for the puppet once more, letting its small wooden limbs dangle as if to remind them of its fragility, its dependence on something greater to give it life. His eyes, deep and unwavering, held a glimmer of compassion as he looked upon the puppet. "Imagine," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, yet it resonated powerfully, "if the puppeteer, moved by love for his creation, wanted it to dance freely, to choose its own movements." With delicate precision, Jesus took a small knife and began to slice through the strings one by one. First an arm, then a leg, until finally, every string was cut and the puppet lay still in his hand. The disciples watched, enraptured, as the puppet's limbs rested, free from any force pulling it in different directions. Yet now, without the strings, it was motionless, helpless. "Now," Jesus continued, looking up at them, "the puppet is free, but it cannot act on its own. Freedom, without purpose or understanding, can sometimes feel empty." The disciples felt a new realization settle upon them, a complex truth that both liberated and unsettled them. Freedom, they now saw, was not merely about breaking chains or releasing constraints. It was about knowing one's purpose, choosing one's path, and walking it with faith and integrity. Each of them felt the enormity of this lesson, sensing that their lives, though seemingly free, had often been guided by unseen forces of habit, expectation, or fear. They were learning that true freedom required wisdom, courage, and most of all, love. The night had deepened, the stars above glowing brighter as the fire dwindled to embers. The disciples remained seated, the air thick with introspection. James, his voice steady yet laced with a hint of vulnerability, finally broke the silence. "Master," he began, his eyes fixed on the ground, "I have always wondered if I would be strong enough to stand on my own. If I were truly free, would I choose the path of righteousness, or would I stumble and stray?" Jesus regarded James with a look of profound understanding. His gaze seemed to hold the weight of countless lifetimes, of wisdom gathered across the ages. "Strength, James," he said softly, "comes not from the absence of struggle, but from the courage to face it. Freedom means having the courage to confront your own weakness, to accept your flaws, and to choose love over fear, again and again." The words struck James like a revelation, and he felt a warmth rise within him, a quiet resolve. One by one, the other disciples began to share their own fears and doubts. They spoke of past mistakes, of moments when they had faltered, and of their fears about the future. Each story was met with compassion and acceptance from Jesus, who listened without judgment. For the first time, the disciples felt as though they could fully reveal themselves, without fear of rejection. They understood that their journey was not about being flawless but about choosing to rise, to continue walking even when they stumbled. Jesus' teachings were not just lessons to follow but an invitation to embrace their humanity with grace and courage. As dawn began to creep into the valley, the first faint rays of sunlight illuminating the rugged cliffs and scattered brush, Jesus spoke softly about the nature of love. His voice, gentle yet filled with conviction, seemed to blend with the whisper of the morning breeze. "True love does not seek to control or bind," he said, watching as the disciples' faces softened, their hearts opening to receive his words. "It seeks to set free. Just as a parent releases a child to find his way, so does God offer us freedom. This freedom is not a license to wander aimlessly, it is an invitation to choose love, to choose sacrifice, to live not for ourselves but for others." The disciples felt a new depth of understanding blossom within them. For the first time, they saw that love was not just an emotion or a bond. It was an act of trust, a choice to let go of control and let others walk their path, even if it meant they would face hardships. They understood that Jesus was not just asking them to follow him blindly, he was asking them to follow out of love and faith, not out of obligation. As they reflected on his words, a quiet peace settled upon them. They realized that love and sacrifice were intertwined, that true freedom meant loving deeply enough to allow others to choose their paths, even when it meant they might face pain or suffering. The disciples sat in awe, feeling the warmth of dawn spreading over them, as if nature itself were embracing this newfound understanding of love. Their hearts swelled with gratitude, their souls lifted by a profound sense of liberation. They knew that, as followers of Jesus, they were called not to control but to serve, to give freely, and to trust in a love that sought not to bind but to uplift and empower. With the dawn's light casting golden hues over the valley, Jesus continued to speak, his voice steady and filled with quiet authority. Faith, he said, is not a chain, nor is it a burden. It is a choice made each day to trust in something greater than ourselves. To walk in faith is to walk in freedom, for true faith allows you to move through life unbound by fear or doubt. The disciples listened intently, the morning's beauty around them amplifying the peace they felt within. They realized that their journey with Jesus was not one of blind obedience but of chosen devotion. Their commitment to him was not something imposed upon them, but something they embraced with open hearts. Each disciple felt the truth of his words resonate deeply. They had followed Jesus willingly, drawn to his teachings and his compassion, yet they also recognized the fear that had sometimes accompanied their faith. The fear of losing him, of facing the unknown without his guidance. But now, as they looked upon his face, radiant in the morning light, they felt a surge of courage. Faith, they realized, was not a passive act. It was an active choice to walk a path that was often challenging, often uncertain, yet always filled with purpose. In that moment they felt truly free. Free to believe, to question, to walk their path with faith and love. They understood that Jesus was not asking them to forsake their doubts or suppress their fears. Instead, he was inviting them to embrace those parts of themselves, to see them as stepping stones on the path to greater faith. As the light grew brighter, illuminating every corner of the valley, the disciples felt a profound sense of joy. They knew that this freedom, this faith, would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. As the morning sun fully rose, casting a golden glow over the valley, Jesus looked at each of them, his gaze filled with love and warmth. He spoke slowly, each word resonating with a depth that stirred their souls. "Remember this," he said, "the strings of love are not ones that bind or control. They are the ties of choice, of kindness, of compassion that you give freely. I am always with you, not to pull your strings, but to walk beside you as you find your own way." His voice was soft, yet the message struck deep within each disciple's heart. The disciples felt tears well in their eyes, not from sorrow, but from a profound sense of gratitude and peace. They understood now that they were not puppets, bound to the will of another, but free souls, capable of choosing love, compassion, and faith on their own. Jesus had not come to control them but to set them free, to empower them to become the people they were meant to be. Each disciple felt a new strength rise within them, a quiet confidence that came from knowing they had been given a gift more precious than any commandment, a gift of true, unconditional love. In that moment they felt the true depth of God's love, a love that did not seek to dominate but to uplift, to allow them to walk their path with courage and grace. The disciples knew that this lesson would stay with them forever, a guiding light in times of darkness, a source of strength when they felt lost or afraid. They realized that their journey with Jesus was only the beginning, that the path ahead would be challenging, but that they would walk it freely with hearts full of love and faith. As the valley filled with the warmth of the morning sun, the disciples stood, ready to continue their journey. They gathered their belongings, each one feeling a renewed sense of purpose and strength. They walked beside Jesus, not as followers bound by duty but as friends bound by love. Their hearts were light, yet filled with a profound sense of responsibility, knowing that they carried within them a truth that could change the world. They had been given the freedom to choose, to love, and to live a life of faith, and they were determined to carry this gift forward. As they left the valley, each step felt purposeful, as if they were treading a path paved by divine love and guidance. They knew that their journey with Jesus was far from over, that the challenges they would face would test their faith and their resolve. But they also knew that they would face those challenges not as puppets, bound by strings, but as free souls, capable of choosing love and compassion in every moment. Jesus walked with them, his presence a constant reminder of the love that had set them free, a love that would guide them wherever their paths might lead. With each step, the disciples felt the weight of Jesus' final message. They were not bound by strings but by the choice to love, to serve, and to live with faith. And as they walked forward into the unknown, they carried within them the wisdom of a master who had come not to bind them, but to set them free, to walk beside them as they found their way. The journey ahead was uncertain, but they faced it with open hearts, filled with the peace of knowing they had been given a gift beyond measure, the gift of true, unbounded freedom. This is end of the story. Comment Amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.